Hi guys, welcome back or welcome to DreamWorks Switch to Life. And in today's video, we're going to be reviewing All Hail King Julien, which is what I would consider the best of the Madagascar TV shows. And I'm just gonna say a big major reason for that is what this series does for the lore of the Madagascar franchise, by which I mean it actually introduces some lore. But before we can dive into that, we have to talk about the elephant in the room. The series is a Netflix original, which means it used to be available exclusively on Netflix. But now Netflix no longer has the show because they lost the rights to it. So it's not really on a streaming service anywhere, even though I really think it should be going to Peacock. But with that in mind, you can still buy the series for yourself on either Amazon or Vudu. In fact, I bought mine on Amazon, and that's how I got this footage. Speaking of the footage, let's talk about the animation quality. The animation is honestly extremely good, especially considering that this is a TV show. It looks almost as good as the movies. In fact, I might actually argue that it looks better than the first Madagascar film. I guess it's just that this series was made back when DreamWorks actually cared about their TV shows. Now, let's talk about the voice acting. The voice acting for this series was actually really good. Granted, it didn't have a lot of the voice actors from the movies, but then again, there weren't a lot of characters. Of course, you had King Julien and Maurice. They were actually played by completely different actors, but they still sounded like their movie counterparts, which was honestly really great. And then, of course, there was Mort. He was played by his movie actor, which, yeah, gotta love that. And of course, spoiler alert, at the very end of the series, we see Alex the Lion show up for about 5 seconds, played by someone who's definitely not Ben Stiller. And to that I say, why not just use the actual clip from the movie instead of needing to animate and cast a whole new scene? But it's not limited to those guys. There are tons of original characters who are included in this series, and I mean tons of characters. My personal favorite voice acting had to come from Clover. I mean, the thing is, Clover is shouting and roaring and doing all kinds of crazy stuff, so big props to her voice actress. But there's also tons of other characters introduced, a lot of whom become villains that King Julien fights in some episodes, but there's also plenty of other characters who are just citizens of the kingdom that King Julien rules over. Now let's talk about the music. The music for the series is actually extremely great and definitely catchy. Honestly, if you go and listen to the soundtrack, there's bound to be one song that's gonna get stuck in your head. But the music is just really good. In fact, I am just going to say it. This series probably has the best theme song out of any DreamWorks TV show. And now let's talk about the humor. I gotta say that I really enjoyed the humor for this series. Not only was it really funny, but there's definitely some points in the series where it's clear that this show was not just made for kids. There's definitely a lot of adult jokes that kids would not understand, but adults will definitely find funny. But with that in mind, it's time to talk about the story. And I gotta say that I really enjoyed the story of this series, even though there technically isn't really any. For one thing, there's a bunch of random stuff going on where it's Weirdmageddon or whatever, and a lot of the episodes are just there for the humor and don't really add much to the plot. However, there's also a lot more episodes where there's a ton of brand new characters who return from previous episodes as major villains. And, well, actually, I'm not really going to talk a lot about some of the major characters because some of them have very interesting story arcs, and honestly, it's best if you just watch their stories unfold as you progress through the series. So, what you may not know is that King Julien is actually King Julien the 13th. Previously, there were 12 kings, and at the start of the series, the kingdom is being ruled over by his uncle, King Julien the 12th. So, King Julien the 12th hears a prophecy that says the one who wears the crown will be eaten by the Fusa. So, King Julien the 12th decides to retire and pass off the crown to King Julien the 13th, the one we know and love. Later in episode 1, King Julien the 13th is actually eaten, or at least, small part of him is eaten.
And I cannot believe Masakura was wrong about the Fosa eating me.
I never said all of you.
Wow, that is a large butt chunk to eat off me there.
But luckily, for the most part, he remains unchanged. So throughout the rest of the series, we see King Julien the 13th ruling over the kingdom with a lot of pride. And I really love how the series dives into the struggles that come with being a king. You want to be loved by your subjects, but at the same time, you also want to help them. And you also kind of want to be left alone to do your own thing and just be a king. And sometimes King Julien wants to party, like all the time. For the most part, though, he makes the kingdom a much better and happier place, especially thanks to Uncle King Julien, who ruled the kingdom in fear. But with King Julien, he rules the kingdom by spreading fun, which is really great. Unfortunately, he does tend to make a lot of enemies due to a bunch of very weird and wacky hijinks that he constantly gets himself into. Thankfully, he does have his bodyguard, Clover, who is basically all rage, and she's pretty much willing to fight anybody over anything. But at the same time, she does take her duty as bodyguard to the king very seriously, which is really great because King Julien is constantly putting himself in danger. So, as with the series progresses, we see King Julien get into a lot of trouble over the course of the first 2 seasons. Then, during the 3rd season, we're introduced to King Julien's parents, Princess Julienne, the sister to Uncle King Julien, and thus not the inheritor of the crown, and her husband, Prince Barty. And unfortunately, the 2 of them don't really care much about anything except for living a life of luxury. In fact, they don't even care that much about their own son, which is really disappointing. But anyway, season 4 progresses and we learn a lot more about the characters from the movie. Granted, King Julien's backstory is pretty simple. He was born into the royal bloodline and thus destined to take over as King of Madagascar. But then we also have Maurice, and Maurice's backstory is very complicated. So Maurice was actually not a lemur, but he's an aye who happens to have a mutation that makes him look like a lemur. And it turns out that this mutation is a sign from the gods that apparently this child is supposed to be sacrificed to the bell gods. And unfortunately, his family just decided to go ahead and sacrifice him. Luckily, he was rescued by a baby King Julien, and thanks to his parents, King Julien and Maurice were raised together as friends/siblings, and Maurice eventually became the royal advisor to King Julien. But if you thought Maurice's backstory was complicated, wait until you hear about Mort's backstory.
Mort is only 40% lemur. The other 60% is made up of bear, starfish, sand, potbelly pig, cactus, and a spool of copper wire.
You forgot wood chips.
And to be honest, I have no idea what his backstory is. There's just so much with Mort that it's literally impossible to pin down. In fact, there's just so much going on with Mort's backstory that I can't explain it in this video because it warrants its own video. I actually need to rewatch the series just so I can figure out what his backstory actually is, and then I can make a video about that. So if you really want, make sure to comment down below if you want to see me make the life story of Mort. And with that in mind, the rest of Season 4 is pretty much set up for Season 5. We're introduced to a mountain lemur named Koto, who apparently was responsible for the destruction of his kingdom. And Koto decided to befriend King Julien, and then he goes off on his own, back to his kingdom, which apparently wasn't destroyed, and it turns out that Koto is actually the ruler of his kingdom, and by befriending King Julien, he decided to use that friendship to take over King Julien's kingdom, basically dethroning him, and thus King Julien was forced into exile or he was going to die. So the 5th season is literally titled All Hail King Julien Exiled. And the entire season is basically a 13-episode, 5-hour movie where King Julien is trying to take back his kingdom from the evil mountain lemur Koto. So King Julien and the rest of the gang kind of spend the series mostly split apart, doing their own adventure that eventually culminates in a final battle against Koto, where King Julien finally takes back his crown. And then during season 6, it's mostly just kind of wrapping up the story. We see a lot of the major villains get their own happy endings, or they die. And we also see that Clover, who is King Julien's bodyguard and was not present in the Madagascar movie, that story is actually explained. Turns out in the series finale, Clover actually gets married to another mountain lemur who she's had a crush on way back since season 1.
My name is... But you can call me Sage Moondancer.
Sage is very muscular, but unfortunately, he's also a pacifist. He thinks that peace is the best way to do things, which actually helps because Clover thinks that punching and fighting is the best way to do things. And the two complement each other, forcing them to bring out the best of each other.
If I let you loose, are you gonna punch and kick me?
Not immediately, but I cannot guarantee I won't feel the urge to later.
Not only does Sage manage to keep Clover's rage in check, but also Clover manages to help Sage realize that there is a point where you do need to fight back. So honestly, the series kind of has a very happy ending, and so Clover and Sage get married and move over to the Mountain Lemur Kingdom, which means Clover isn't going to be in the Madagascar movies, but a lot of the other characters in this series actually are in the movies. They just happen to be background lemur characters who help make up the kingdom, and they also might look a little bit different when compared to this series. So with that in mind, that's the end of the story, but honestly, there's a lot more to the series than you might expect. Sometimes part of the series is that there's a bunch of random filler episodes where a bunch of absolute nonsense just happens. Sometimes it's just a fun episode in and of itself. Other times it's very weird and very And a lot of times it just doesn't really make sense from a real world perspective, so you do have to suspend a lot of disbelief. But with that in mind, there's actually a lot of very fun scenes, and it's really funny, not to mention the fact that, well, aided by the great animation and voice acting, I really enjoyed this series and consider it the personal best of the entire Madagascar franchise. But what did you guys think? Make sure to leave your thoughts down below in the comments, and if you want, make sure to support me on my membership page by going to my channel, or just do the free option and subscribe. And if you are subscribed, be sure to keep an eye out for my next video, which will be the Madagascar film review. With that in mind, I hope that you're staying safe out there, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye-bye.
Woo! Enchanté, Mr. Handsome Pants!
Boy meets girl, girl meets boya. Girl got a face beat Helena Troya.
That hussy better keep a paws off my King Julien or she... Oh, her feet, they're so perfect too! I can't take it anymore! I can't take it!